Ladies and gentlemen, I am Hercule Poirot, and I solve mysteries. Welcome to my new case.
It was one of those golden September afternoons when the English countryside seems determined to remind one why poets have spent centuries attempting to capture its particular magic in verse. I had been staying with my friend Hercule Poirot at Whitehaven Court, a charming country hotel where the great detective was, as he assured me, taking the repose, mon ami, to restore the little grey cells. I should have known that crime would not long respect Poirot's desire for tranquility. We were taking tea on the terrace when a motor car came racing up the drive with the sort of urgency that speaks of disaster. From it emerged a tall, distinguished gentleman whose usually composed demeanour was clearly shattered. His evening dress was dishevelled, his face pale with shock. "Monsieur Poirot," he called out, approaching our table with quick, agitated steps. "I am Sir Reginald Ashworth of Ravenscroft Manor. I pray you will forgive the intrusion, but I am in desperate need of your assistance." Poirot set down his teacup with characteristic precision. "But certainly, Sir Reginald. Be seated, I beg of you. This is my friend, Captain Hastings." Sir Reginald collapsed into a chair, his hands trembling as he spoke. "My wife, Lady Margaret Ashworth, has been found dead in our garden maze." "Murdered?" "Murdered?" I exclaimed. "Stabbed through the heart," Sir Reginald continued, his voice hollow. "She was discovered this afternoon by our housemaid at the maze's centre, beside the old stone sundial. The police have been called, but—" He paused, reaching into his jacket. "Before I left for the authorities, I found this on her writing desk." He handed Poirot an envelope addressed in an elegant feminine hand. Poirot opened it carefully, his green eyes scanning the contents before passing it to me. The letter was brief but chilling. "My dearest Reginald, if you are reading this, then my fears have proven justified. I can no longer ignore the signs. Someone in our circle wishes me harm. The maze that has been my sanctuary may well become my tomb. Trust no one completely, for the danger comes from within our own walls. Your devoted wife, Margaret." "She posted this yesterday morning in the village," Sir Reginald explained. "It arrived with the afternoon post, just as our weekend guests were gathering for tea." "Ah," murmured Poirot, his fingertips meeting in their familiar steeple. "And these guests, they remain at Ravenscroft Manor?" "Yes. Inspector Morrison has requested that no one leave until his investigation is complete. There's my nephew Charles, my heir, I'm afraid, and rather in need of funds. My wife's sister, Vivienne, who has always resented Margaret's position. Our long-time friend Dr. Pemberton, who was oddly insistent about examining the body. And Mrs. Hartwell, Margaret's companion, who seems to know more than she's saying." Poirot rose with sudden decision. "Sir Reginald, you will return at once to your manor. Tell the good inspector that Hercule Poirot requests permission to examine the scene. A maze, it is like the human mind, full of false paths and hidden truths. But there is always one true route to the centre." "You'll come?" Sir Reginald's relief was palpable. "Mais oui, a lady who predicts her own murder, a maze that conceals secrets, a circle of suspects, each with motive. This is a case most intriguing for the little grey cells." As we prepared to depart, Poirot turned to me with that familiar gleam in his eye. "Come, Hastings. We go to unravel a puzzle where every path may lead to deception, but only one leads to truth. The lady may be found slain in her maze, but the real labyrinth lies in the hearts and minds of those who surrounded her." Within the hour, we were travelling toward Ravenscroft Manor, where a killer walked among the grieving, confident that the maze's ancient hedges would keep their deadly secret forever. They had not reckoned with Hercule Poirot. The drive to Ravenscroft Manor took us through undulating countryside where autumn was beginning to touch the hedgerows with gold. Sir Reginald sat forward throughout the journey, his hands clasped tightly, speaking only when Poirot's gentle questions drew forth additional details about his household and the mysterious letter that had arrived with such terrible timing. "Tell me, Sir Reginald," Poirot said as we turned through wrought iron gates. "This maze of yours, how well do your guests know its paths?" Margaret knew it perfectly, of course. She could navigate it blindfolded. Sir Reginald's voice caught slightly. "Charles has wandered through it since childhood, though he claims to find it tedious now. Vivienne knows it reasonably well. She and Margaret often walked there together as girls. Dr. Pemberton rarely ventures in, says the close air affects his breathing. Mrs. Hartwell," he paused, "she's always claimed it makes her nervous, gives her what she calls unpleasant fancies." "Most interesting," murmured Poirot. "And your servants? They know the paths, naturally, but would never presume to use the maze for pleasure. Only Martha, our housemaid, goes in regularly to fetch Margaret when she's needed." Ravenscroft Manor emerged before us, like something from a Gothic tale, its ancient grey stones darkened by centuries of English weather. The maze sprawled across the eastern grounds, a vast creation of yew hedges that must have taken generations to achieve their current imposing height. Even from our approach, I could see why Lady Margaret might have found it both sanctuary and, ultimately, trap. Inspector Morrison met us at the entrance, a square-shouldered man with greying whiskers and the wary demeanour of one who had encountered amateur detectives before. "Sir Reginald," he said with a curt nod, then turned sceptical eyes to Poirot. "And you would be the Belgian gentleman I've heard mentioned." "Hercule Poirot, at your service, Inspector." My friend offered his card with characteristic precision. "I do not wish to intrude upon your investigation, but Sir Reginald has requested my assistance. Perhaps I might merely observe." Morrison studied the card, his expression softening slightly. "I've heard your name, Monsieur Poirot. Very well, you may look, but I'll not have my investigation compromised." "But naturally," Poirot agreed. "I seek only to understand." We entered the manor's great hall, where the hush of tragedy lay heavy over polished oak and ancestral portraits. Through the drawing-room doorway, I glimpsed the assembled company, a tableau of grief and barely concealed tension. Charles Ashworth, Sir Reginald's nephew and heir, stood apart from the others, a man of perhaps 30 with the soft features of one unaccustomed to honest labour. His expensive clothes showed subtle signs of wear, and his hands moved restlessly, betraying an inner agitation that his composed expression sought to conceal. Vivienne Blackwood, Lady Margaret's sister, possessed a brittle elegance that seemed to barely contain some powerful emotion. Her dark eyes held a sharp intelligence as they swept over our party, and I noticed how she positioned herself to observe everyone else while remaining slightly apart. Dr. Pemberton, distinguished and authoritative, carried himself with professional dignity, yet there was something in his manner, a barely concealed nervousness, that suggested more than ordinary concern for his patient's demise. His medical bag sat conspicuously beside his chair, as if he had been prepared for an emergency that had already passed. Mrs. Hartwell, the companion, was a woman of middle years whose plain appearance belied remarkably observant eyes. She sat quietly in a corner, watching everything with the careful attention of one accustomed to noting details others might miss. "The scene has been preserved?" Poirot asked Morrison. "Photographed and sketched. The body's been removed to the village morgue, but I can show you exactly where Lady Margaret was found. The weapon, however, remains missing, vanished completely." "Ah," said Poirot, his eyebrows rising slightly. "A knife that disappears. Most intriguing." We crossed the lawn toward the maze, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. The entrance gaped before us like a dark mouth, and as we stepped within, the towering hedges immediately enclosed us in a world of green twilight where sound seemed muffled and perspective distorted. Lady Margaret was found at the centre, Morrison explained as he led us through the twisting passages. The maid, Martha, discovered her at approximately 4:30 when she went to call her for tea. The maze proved to be a bewildering creation, its paths branching and converging in patterns that would confuse any but the most familiar visitor. After several minutes of careful navigation, we reached the heart, a circular clearing dominated by an ancient stone sundial carved with astrological symbols and Latin inscriptions. Here, Morrison indicated a spot beside the sundial. She was lying on her side, one hand extended toward the base of the sundial, as if reaching for something. Poirot knelt carefully, studying the flagstones with his magnifying glass. The sundial drew his particular attention, its elaborate carvings and bronze gnomon casting precise shadows across the weathered stone face. "Most curious," he murmured, running his fingers along the sundial's base. "And you found nothing here? No personal effects, no disturbance of the earth?" "Nothing obvious. Dr. Pemberton was most insistent we note the position of her hand, though. The good doctor was present when the body was discovered?" "Arrived shortly after Martha raised the alarm. Said he'd come to check on Lady Margaret's health. She'd been complaining of headaches recently." Poirot stood, brushing earth from his trousers, his expression thoughtful. As we made our way back through the maze's passages, he remained unusually quiet, and I recognized the signs. The little grey cells were beginning their methodical work, sorting through the puzzle pieces that would eventually reveal the truth behind Lady Margaret's final moments. "Inspector," he said as we emerged into daylight, "with your permission, I should like to speak with each of these people individually. The shock is still fresh. Lies have not yet had time to grow comfortable." Inspector Morrison nodded grudgingly, his weathered face showing the resignation of a man who had learned to accept assistance when offered, regardless of its foreign origins. "Very well, Monsieur Poirot. We'll use Sir Reginald's study for privacy, but I'll be present for each interview. Proper procedure, you understand." "But naturally," Poirot replied with a gracious inclination of his head. "I would not dream of conducting such delicate matters without the proper authorities present." The study proved to be a sanctuary of masculine tradition, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and family portraits whose stern eyes seemed to observe our proceedings with ancestral disapproval. Poirot positioned himself behind the imposing oak desk with characteristic precision, arranging his notebook and pencil in perfect alignment. I took a chair near the tall windows where the afternoon light would allow me to observe our subjects clearly. "Perhaps we might begin with Monsieur Charles," Poirot suggested, his green eyes thoughtful. "As the heir, he will naturally have intimate knowledge of the household dynamics." Charles Ashworth entered with the careful composure of a man conscious of being under scrutiny. Despite his attempt at casual confidence, I noticed his fingers drummed nervously against the chair arm as he settled himself opposite Poirot. "A terrible business, this," Charles began before Poirot could speak. "Poor Aunt Margaret. Though I must confess, I'm not entirely surprised something like this has happened." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed. And why is that, monsieur?" "She'd become rather obsessive lately. About the maze, about imagined threats, always claiming someone was watching her, following her through the grounds. Uncle Reginald was quite concerned about her mental state." "You were close to your aunt?" Poirot inquired gently. Charles shifted uncomfortably. "As close as circumstances allowed. She was generous when it suited her, but could be rather demanding. Always wanting to know about one's finances, one's plans for the future." His voice carried a note of resentment that he couldn't quite suppress. "And your finances, they are in good order?" The question struck home. Charles's composure slipped momentarily, revealing a flash of anger before he recovered. "I fail to see how that's relevant to my aunt's death, Monsieur Poirot." "Perhaps not," Poirot agreed mildly, making a note. "But you will forgive me. I'm curious about all aspects of the household dynamics. The maze, you know it well?" "Since childhood, though I found it rather tedious as I grew older. A place for Aunt Margaret's peculiar meditations, not for grown men." He attempted a dismissive laugh. "I had an appointment with my solicitor in the village this afternoon. Didn't return until after Martha found her." After Charles departed, Poirot called for Vivienne Blackwood. Lady Margaret's sister entered with the bearing of a woman accustomed to observing rather than being observed, her intelligent dark eyes taking in every detail of the room before settling on Poirot with frank curiosity. "Mademoiselle Blackwood," Poirot began, "my condolences on the loss of your sister." "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot," she replied, her voice cool and measured, "though I confess I am more angry than grieved. Margaret was a strong woman to be cut down like this." She trailed off, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. "You speak frankly. Was there often friction between you and your sister?" Vivienne's laugh held no humor. "Sisters often squabble, Monsieur Poirot. Margaret always had a way of getting what she wanted. Even Ravenscroft Manor, it should have been shared between us, but our parents favored the beautiful, charming daughter over the merely practical one. Yet you remained close." "Family obligations," she said curtly. And Margaret enjoyed having people dependent upon her generosity. She wielded that dependency like a weapon when it suited her purposes. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "The maze? You know it well?" "Better than anyone save Margaret herself. We spent countless hours there as children." Her expression softened momentarily. "Recently, though, I noticed someone had been moving the markers." "Markers, mademoiselle?" "Small stones and bits of ribbon that Margaret placed at path divisions years ago. They were no secret, but only someone with patience and intimate knowledge could relocate them convincingly. Just enough to send an unfamiliar visitor slightly astray." "Most interesting," Poirot murmured. "And who possessed such knowledge?" "Charles knew them from childhood, though he claimed to find the maze tedious. Dr. Pemberton rarely ventures in. Says the close air affects his breathing. Mrs. Hartwell—" She paused significantly. "Mrs. Hartwell notices everything, though she claims the maze makes her nervous." When Dr. Pemberton entered, he brought with him the unmistakable authority of medical expertise. Silver-haired and distinguished, he settled his considerable frame into the chair with professional gravity. "A shocking business, Monsieur Poirot." He began immediately. "Lady Margaret was in excellent health when I examined her last week. This attack must have been completely unexpected." "You examined the body, doctor?" "Professional instinct. The wound was precise. A single thrust directly to the heart. Death would have been almost instantaneous." He adjusted his spectacles. "The weapon was a narrow blade, quite sharp. Not a kitchen knife. Something more specialized." "And you noticed the position of her hand?" "Indeed. Most curious. She was reaching toward the base of the sundial, as if trying to leave some sort of message. Lady Margaret had been complaining of headaches recently, and strange sensations, a feeling of being watched. I'd come to check on her condition." As the interviews concluded, Poirot sat back, his fingertips meeting in their familiar steeple. The little grey cells were clearly at work, sorting through the web of relationships, resentments, and secrets that surrounded Lady Margaret's final moments. Each suspect had motive, opportunity, and intimate knowledge of the maze's secrets, yet something in their testimonies didn't quite align with the methodical precision of the crime itself. The truth, like the path through the maze, would require careful navigation through layers of deception to reach its heart. The silence that followed Dr. Pemberton's departure seemed to settle over the study like dust, broken only by the soft scratch of Poirot's pencil as he made his final notes. Inspector Morrison shifted restlessly in his chair, clearly eager to move beyond what he evidently considered preliminary formalities. "Mrs. Hartwell next, I believe," Poirot said quietly, setting down his pencil with characteristic precision. "The companion often sees what others overlook, for she exists in that curious position of being both within the family circle and outside it." Mrs. Hartwell entered with the careful composure of a woman long accustomed to moving through other people's homes without disturbing their rhythms. Her plain grey dress and unremarkable features might have rendered her invisible in any gathering, yet her eyes held an intelligence that I suspected missed very little indeed. "Mrs. Hartwell," Poirot began gently, "you have been companion to Lady Margaret for how long?" 7 years, Monsieur Poirot, since shortly after my husband's death left me in rather reduced circumstances. Her voice carried the precise diction of a woman who had once moved in better circles. Lady Margaret was kind enough to offer me a position when others might have overlooked a widow of modest means. And you were devoted to her. A shadow crossed Mrs. Hartwell's features, so brief that Inspector Morrison missed it entirely. Lady Margaret was complex, generous when it suited her, but she had a way of ensuring that one's gratitude remained absolute. She possessed an uncanny ability to learn one's vulnerabilities and use them to maintain loyalty. Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "You speak with remarkable candor, madame." Mrs. Hartwell's hands twisted in her lap. "My husband left debts, Monsieur Poirot. Gambling debts that would have meant scandal, perhaps even legal consequences, had they become widely known. Lady Margaret settled them quietly, but she never allowed me to forget the obligation. Where else could a woman of my age and circumstances go? The maze," Poirot continued after making a careful note. "You avoid it, I am told. It has always felt oppressive to me. All those twisting paths, the way sound carries strangely within those high hedges. But Lady Margaret insisted I learn the route to the centre, said I might need to fetch her in emergencies." She shuddered slightly. "I managed it, but I never grew comfortable with the place." "And this afternoon, where were you when the tragedy occurred?" "In my sitting room, attending to correspondence. Lady Margaret had been restless after luncheon, said she must go to the maze to think. She seemed expectant somehow, as if she believed something important would finally become clear to her." When Mrs. Hartwell departed, Poirot called for Martha, the housemaid who had discovered the body. The girl entered with obvious reluctance, her reddened hands clasped tightly before her, eyes still swollen from weeping. "Now then, Martha," Inspector Morrison began briskly, "tell us exactly what happened when you found Lady Margaret." "Mrs. Hartwell sent me to fetch her ladyship for tea, sir. About 4:30 it was. I don't much like the maze, but her ladyship always said I was the only one who never got lost." Despite her distress, she managed a tremulous smile. "There's a way, see. If you keep to the left wall and count your turns proper, you can reach the centre without wandering." Poirot leaned forward with sudden interest. "This method, Martha. Who else knew of it?" "Oh, most everyone, sir. Her ladyship never made it secret. Master Charles knew it from when he was small, though he always said the maze was tedious. Miss Vivienne learned it too, years back. Even Dr. Pemberton knew, though he claimed the close air bothered his breathing." "And when you reached the centre today?" Martha's composure crumbled. "She was lying there by the sundial, sir, on her side like she'd just fallen. Her hand was stretched out, almost touching the stone base. There was blood on her dress, and she was so still." The girl covered her face with her hands. After Martha had been gently dismissed, Inspector Morrison rose with evident satisfaction, pacing the study with the air of a man who had solved a puzzle. "Well, Monsieur Poirot, I believe we have our murderer," he announced confidently. "Everything points to Charles Ashworth. The motive is clear: financial desperation and a substantial inheritance. His alibi about the solicitor's appointment has proven false. I've just received word from the village that his appointment was scheduled for tomorrow, not today. He was seen returning to the manor gates at 4:15, claiming to have been away since 3 o'clock. "Ah," Poirot murmured, his fingertips meeting in their familiar steeple. "A discrepancy in the alibi. More than a discrepancy, a blatant fabrication. Charles knows the maze intimately, could navigate it without detection, and had ample time to commit the murder and dispose of the weapon before making his theatrical return. A classic case of a desperate heir eliminating the obstacle to his inheritance." Poirot regarded the inspector with those penetrating green eyes. "You are convinced, then, that Monsieur Charles is our culprit?" "Absolutely. All the pieces fit perfectly. We'll arrest him within the hour." "And the letter, Inspector?" Poirot picked up Lady Margaret's elegant warning. trust no one completely, for the danger comes from within our own walls. Does this not suggest a more subtle perpetrator than a desperate nephew making clumsy lies about solicitors?" Morrison waved dismissively. "A clever ruse to throw us off the scent, or perhaps Lady Margaret was indeed growing paranoid, as her husband suggested. Charles could have exploited that very paranoia, knowing she would write such a letter." Poirot rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the darkening maze where shadows were beginning to pool between the ancient hedges. "It is possible, Inspector. But does it not strike you as almost too convenient? The obvious suspect, the clear motive, the easily discovered lie. It is as if it were designed to be found." "Are you suggesting I'm missing something, Monsieur Poirot?" "I am merely observing that the human mind under duress does not always follow the most straightforward path. This crime has a certain precision, an elegance, the choice of location, the missing weapon, the prophetic letter. These speak of a mind that delights in the construction of puzzles, not merely the grasping of inheritance." Poirot turned from the window, his eyes gleaming with familiar intensity. "No, Inspector. In my experience, when the obvious solution presents itself so clearly, so completely, it is often because someone wishes it to be found. The true culprit may yet walk among us, hidden behind the very clarity of this apparent solution." I recognized the signs. The little grey cells were working, sorting through the contradictions and inconsistencies that others had overlooked. While Inspector Morrison prepared to close his case, I knew that for Hercule Poirot, the real investigation was only beginning. The maze of human deception, it seemed, was far more intricate than any garden labyrinth, and we had barely begun to chart its hidden passages. Inspector Morrison's satisfaction was evident as he straightened his shoulders, clearly relishing the moment of resolution. Within minutes, Charles Ashworth was summoned back to the study, his face draining of color as the inspector methodically laid out the damning evidence, the fabricated alibi, the desperate financial circumstances, his intimate knowledge of the maze, and the suspicious timing of his return to the manor. "Charles Ashworth," Morrison declared with official gravity, "I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Lady Margaret Ashworth." Charles stared in stunned disbelief, his composure crumbling entirely. "Arrest? This is absolutely preposterous. I swear upon my honor, I had nothing whatsoever to do with my aunt's death. The solicitor's appointment, yes, I confused the dates, but I was merely walking the grounds, trying to clear my head after our disagreement about money. Surely you cannot believe—" "We have sufficient evidence, Mr. Ashworth," Morrison interrupted curtly, signaling to the constable waiting in the corridor. "Anything further you wish to say can be addressed through proper legal channels." As Charles was led away, still protesting his innocence with increasing desperation, Sir Reginald appeared in the doorway. His face had aged considerably since our arrival, etched now with lines of grief and bewilderment that spoke of a man whose world had been irrevocably shattered. "Inspector Morrison assures me the matter is resolved," he said quietly, though his voice carried little conviction. "Charles will be charged tomorrow. I confess, Monsieur Poirot, I find it nearly impossible to believe my nephew capable of such violence, yet the evidence appears overwhelming." Poirot had remained motionless throughout the arrest, those penetrating green eyes fixed not on the drama unfolding before us, but on some invisible pattern that only he could perceive. Now he turned with characteristic precision, his expression thoughtful. "Sir Reginald," he said gently, "might I impose upon your hospitality for the evening? There are certain aspects of this case that require further consideration, and I find that scenes of tragedy often reveal their secrets more readily in the quiet hours of reflection. Of course, Monsieur Poirot, any assistance you can provide would be most welcome." Sir Reginald paused, his hands trembling slightly. "Though I must admit, I rather hope the matter is indeed settled. The thought that someone within my own household could have—" He couldn't complete the terrible thought. After Inspector Morrison departed with his prisoner, Sir Reginald sank heavily into a chair, his composure finally cracking. She warned me, you know, he whispered, almost to himself. Not in explicit terms, but Margaret had become convinced that someone within our circle meant her harm. She spoke of patterns she couldn't ignore. Small things that seemed insignificant individually but formed a disturbing picture when considered together. A book moved from her bedside table, footsteps in the maze when she believed herself alone, glimpses of figures slipping behind hedges who vanished when she called out. I dismissed it all as nervous fancies, suggested she was overtiring herself with household tensions. Poirot leaned forward with sudden interest. She used that precise word. Patterns? Yes. She said there were patterns that only became visible when one stepped back to observe the whole rather than focusing on individual incidents. She even laughed about it once, saying perhaps the maze had finally claimed her as its own. His voice broke slightly, and still I did nothing to protect her. "Do not reproach yourself, Sir Reginald," Poirot said with genuine compassion. "Most of us choose to believe in the fundamental sanity of our world until circumstances force us to confront its darker possibilities." As evening settled over Ravenscroft Manor, Poirot excused himself after a light supper, claiming fatigue. But when the household had retired for the night, he appeared at my door fully dressed, his eyes bright with purpose. "Come, mon ami," he whispered. "The moon provides excellent illumination tonight, and I believe our maze may yet yield its secrets to those who understand how to interpret its silent testimony." We made our way quietly through moonlit corridors and out onto the silvered grounds. The maze loomed before us, its ancient hedges casting intricate shadows that shifted and danced in the ethereal light. Poirot moved with surprising stealth for such a meticulous man, using his electric torch sparingly. "You doubt Inspector Morrison's conclusion entirely?" I asked as we approached the maze entrance. "I doubt the convenient simplicity of it, Hastings. Consider the sophistication required, a crime committed in a location that is itself a puzzle, a victim who anticipates danger yet cannot identify its source, a weapon that vanishes without trace. This speaks of a mind that delights in the construction of elaborate deceptions, not the desperate flailing of a financially embarrassed nephew." We followed Martha's described route through the twisting passages until we reached the heart where Lady Margaret had met her end. The ancient sundial stood sentinel in the center, its bronze gnomon casting sharp shadows across the carved stone face. Poirot circled it methodically, his torch beam playing over every surface with scientific precision. Inspector Morrison was thorough, I observed. But the good inspector was seeking evidence of Charles's guilt. Sometimes, Hastings, we discover only what we expect to find. Poirot knelt beside the sundial's base, running his fingers along the carved Latin inscriptions with delicate care. Tempus fugit. How ironically appropriate for our poor Lady Margaret. His fingers paused at one section where the carving seemed slightly disturbed. With careful pressure, he worked at a loose stone until it shifted, revealing a hidden cavity within the sundial's base. From this secret compartment, he withdrew a small leather journal filled with Lady Margaret's elegant handwriting. "Mon Dieu," he breathed, scanning the pages rapidly. "Our victim was far more perceptive than anyone realized. Listen to this entry from 3 days past. The pattern becomes clear at last. Someone has been extraordinarily clever, but not quite clever enough. They believe me a foolish woman obsessed with imaginary threats, but I have been watching too." The little grey cells had found their crucial evidence, and I realized that Charles Ashworth's arrest was merely the opening gambit in a far more sophisticated game of deception. Poirot's torch beam illuminated the elegant script as he continued reading from Lady Margaret's hidden journal, each entry revealing a woman far more perceptive than anyone had credited. The pages documented not random paranoia, but a methodical campaign of psychological manipulation that had been unfolding for months. "Listen to this, Hastings," Poirot murmured, his voice barely above a whisper in the moonlit maze. From 1 week before her death, the medicine bottles have been tampered with again. Not the contents, something far more subtle. The labels switched between my headache powders and sleeping tablets. A small thing, easily dismissed as my own confusion, but it follows the pattern. Someone wishes me to doubt my own perceptions, to appear unstable to those around me. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Good heavens, Poirot. She was being systematically tormented. Indeed. And observe this entry from 5 days ago. My correspondence has been intercepted. Letters I believed private have been read before reaching their intended recipients. Even my personal physician has received communications I never sent, inquiring about treatments for nervous disorders I do not possess. Poirot turned several pages, his expression growing increasingly grave. But here, mon ami, is the most significant revelation. 3 days before her death. I know who has been orchestrating this elaborate deception, though proving it will require extreme care. They have positioned themselves perfectly, trusted, seemingly devoted, with access to every aspect of my daily routine. She doesn't name them directly. No, but she was too intelligent to commit such dangerous specifics to writing. However, Poirot's torch focused on the final entry, dated the morning of her death. Today I shall set my trap. If my suspicions prove correct, my tormentor will reveal themselves when they believe me most vulnerable. Should anything happen to me, the evidence lies where only the truly observant would think to look, in the place where time stands still and shadows tell truth. The sundial, I breathed. She knew she was in mortal danger, yet she deliberately provoked her killer. She was attempting to gather proof, Hastings, but her opponent proved more ruthless than she anticipated. Poirot carefully replaced the journal in its hiding place and restored the loose stone. This is not a desperate act of greed, but the culmination of an elaborate psychological campaign designed to drive Lady Margaret to apparent madness before eliminating her entirely. As we made our way back through the maze's twisting passages, Poirot's mind was clearly racing ahead, fitting together pieces of a puzzle far more complex than Inspector Morrison had imagined. We returned to the manor in silence, the weight of our discovery settling over us like a shroud. The next morning broke grey and oppressive, the atmosphere at breakfast strained to breaking point. Sir Reginald looked as if he had not slept. His grief hung over him like a heavy cloak. Dr. Pemberton maintained his professional demeanour, though his hands trembled slightly as he buttered his toast. Mrs. Hartwell sat quietly, her observant eyes missing nothing, while Vivienne possessed an almost imperious composure that seemed newly acquired. Poirot made conversation on trivial topics, whether tea the superiority of Belgian bread, though I recognized the familiar pattern. My friend was waiting. He was also watching. It was Vivienne who finally broke the pretense. "I suppose we are expected to feel relieved that the matter is resolved," she said suddenly, setting down her cup with a sharp click. The dreadful business neatly contained, the appropriate scapegoat identified. "Vivienne," Sir Reginald protested weakly. "Charles is hardly a scapegoat. The evidence is convenient," she interrupted. "Far too convenient. Charles is vain, foolish, and appallingly bad with money, but he is also a coward. Do you truly see him stalking Margaret through her beloved maze and stabbing her in the heart?" Dr. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. "Fear and desperation can drive men to extraordinary acts. We must not let sentiment blind us to what is comfortable," Vivienne cut in. "That is what this is, Doctor. A comfortable solution that spares us from wondering whether something colder, more calculating, moves among us." Poirot watched with quiet interest. "You are not convinced of Charles' guilt, mademoiselle?" "No. And what is more, Margaret was not convinced either. She feared something subtle, insidious, a mind that would enjoy watching her unravel." Mrs. Hartwell spoke for the first time, her voice steady but low. "Lady Margaret did say, quite recently, that if something were to happen to her, it would not be in a fit of passion but as the last move in a long game. She asked if I had ever felt as though someone were placing invisible nets about my life. Poirot's eyes flickered with interest. She said that. To you directly? Yes. She remarked that the cleverest prison is the one whose bars you do not notice until you are already trapped. As the uncomfortable breakfast concluded, Poirot rose with characteristic precision. If you will excuse me, I should like to revisit certain aspects of yesterday's investigation. There are patterns, I think, that require closer examination. Later, as we walked the grounds, I asked, "What path are we following now, Poirot?" "The psychological one, Hastings," he replied, his green eyes gleaming with familiar intensity. "We have walked the paths of you, now we must walk the paths of motive and fear. Someone here built a maze not of hedges, but of the mind. Lady Margaret discovered this truth too late to save herself, but not too late to guide us toward justice. The little grey cells, they sing with the melody of her final, desperate song." Our morning investigation had yielded crucial insights, but Poirot's demeanor suggested the little grey cells were orchestrating something far more significant than mere evidence-gathering. After a subdued luncheon, he requested that Sir Reginald assemble the remaining household members in the drawing-room, his manner carrying an authority that brooked no opposition. The atmosphere was electric with unspoken tension as we gathered. Sir Reginald appeared utterly exhausted, the weight of tragedy etched deeply into his features. Vivienne maintained her brittle composure, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. Dr. Pemberton sat with professional dignity, yet I noticed a subtle rigidity in his posture that hadn't been present before. Mrs. Hartwell occupied her customary position near the window, observing everything with that quiet intelligence I had come to respect. Poirot positioned himself before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back in characteristic fashion. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the Persian carpet, creating an almost theatrical setting for what I sensed would be a crucial confrontation. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying that particular weight that preceded his most significant revelations. "I have spent considerable time examining not merely the physical evidence of this crime, but the psychological landscape that preceded it. Lady Margaret's murder was not an impulsive act of greed, but the culmination of an elaborate campaign of mental torture." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the assembled group like a shroud. "Consider the sophistication required, a victim who predicts her own death, yet cannot identify her tormentor, a weapon that vanishes without trace, a maze that becomes both sanctuary and trap. This speaks of a mind that delights in the construction of psychological puzzles, not the desperate flailing of a financially embarrassed nephew." Dr. Pemberton shifted almost imperceptibly, but Poirot's keen eyes caught the movement. "The journal we discovered reveals a woman under systematic assault. Not physical, but mental. Her medications tampered with, her correspondence intercepted, her very perceptions called into question. Someone with intimate knowledge of her habits, her routines, her vulnerabilities. But who could orchestrate such an elaborate deception?" Sir Reginald asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone with professional knowledge of the human mind," Poirot replied, his gaze settling on Dr. Pemberton with laser-like intensity. "Someone who understood precisely how to erode a person's confidence in their own sanity. Someone who possessed both the medical authority to create false narratives of mental instability and the access to implement them." Dr. Pemberton's face had grown increasingly pale, but he maintained his professional composure. "Monsieur Poirot, surely you're not suggesting—" "I am suggesting, Doctor, that you have been conducting an experiment, not in medicine, but in psychological control. The letters you received inquiring about Lady Margaret's nervous disposition. Letters she never wrote. The medications you prescribed for conditions she did not possess. The gradual construction of a medical record that would support a finding of mental instability." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Mrs. Hartwell gasped audibly, while Vivienne leaned forward with sharp attention. But it was Dr. Pemberton's reaction that proved most revealing. Instead of indignant denial, his features settled into an expression of calculating assessment. "You have no proof of such allegations," he said quietly, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. "Ah, but I do," Poirot replied smoothly. "Lady Margaret's journal documents every aspect of your campaign. The switched medication labels, the intercepted correspondence, the systematic erosion of her confidence. She was far more perceptive than you credited, Doctor. She recognized the pattern and set a trap." "A trap?" Dr. Pemberton's composure cracked slightly. "She deliberately provoked you, knowing that your need to complete your psychological experiment would override caution. She went to the maze that final afternoon not as a victim, but as a hunter. Unfortunately, she underestimated your ruthlessness." Dr. Pemberton rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with jarring violence. "This is preposterous," he exploded, his professional facade shattering completely. "You're describing some elaborate conspiracy where none exists. Lady Margaret was a paranoid woman, prone to flights of fancy. Her journal is the product of a diseased mind, not evidence of any systematic campaign." His outburst was so sudden, so completely out of character for the composed physician we had known, that it served as a confession more damning than any evidence could have been. The room fell silent, everyone staring at the doctor, who now stood trembling, his carefully constructed mask finally torn away. Poirot watched him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see directly into the human soul. "The mind that can conceive such psychological torture, Doctor, is far more diseased than any Lady Margaret might have possessed. You sought to play God with another human being's sanity, and when she proved too strong for your manipulations, you resorted to more direct methods. The psychological game was complete. Dr. Pemberton's dramatic reaction had revealed the cold, calculating intelligence behind Lady Margaret's torment, and the little grey cells had successfully exposed the true nature of the crime that had masqueraded as simple murder for inheritance." The silence that followed Dr. Pemberton's outburst stretched like a taut wire, each person in the drawing room frozen by the sudden revelation of something cold and calculating beneath the physician's professional facade. Sir Reginald stared at his longtime friend with dawning horror, while Vivienne's sharp eyes missed nothing of the doctor's transformation from composed healer to cornered predator. Poirot remained motionless, those penetrating green eyes studying Dr. Pemberton with the careful attention of an entomologist examining a particularly dangerous specimen. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority that had exposed countless criminals. "You reveal yourself by the very defense you make, Doctor," he said softly. "You return again and again to the idea of Lady Margaret's instability. It was the cornerstone of your design, n'est-ce pas? You needed her to be seen as mentally unsound so that when the end came, no one would look too closely at the manner of her death or at the one who had so carefully prepared the stage." Dr. Pemberton's hands trembled slightly as he attempted to regain his composure. "I was her physician, Monsieur Poirot. I had a professional duty to monitor her condition when she began displaying signs of paranoid delusions." "Ah, but there lies your error," Poirot replied, moving with characteristic precision to the center of the room. "Lady Margaret was displaying no such signs. She was, in fact, responding rationally to a very real threat. Her journal, which I discovered hidden within the Sundial's base, documents not paranoia, but a methodical campaign of psychological manipulation." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the assembled group. "Consider the sophistication required. Mes amis, the switching of medication labels to make her doubt her own memory, the interception of her correspondence, the creation of a false medical narrative suggesting nervous disorders she did not possess. This was not the work of a desperate heir seeking quick inheritance. This was the calculated experiment of a mind that delighted in psychological control." Mrs. Hartwell gasped audibly. "The letters," she mentioned, "about treatments for conditions she claimed not to have." "Precisely, madam. Dr. Pemberton had been constructing a medical record that would support a finding of mental instability, and who better to interpret that record than the very physician who had created it? Poirot's gaze fixed on the doctor. There was also the matter of the codicil, was there not? Lady Margaret had been considering giving you advisory power over certain charitable trusts, and over Miss Vivienne's allowance. Most convenient should the beneficiary be declared of unsound mind. Dr. Pemberton's jaw tightened, but he maintained his defensive posture. You're building castles on mist, Monsieur Poirot. Lady Margaret was indeed considering such arrangements, but only because she trusted my professional judgment. There is nothing sinister in prudent estate planning. No, Doctor, but there is something most sinister in the murder that followed when your victim proved too intelligent for your manipulations. Poirot moved to the window, gazing toward the maze where Lady Margaret had met her end. She set a trap for you, did she not? Her final entry speaks of confronting her tormentor when they believed her most vulnerable. She went to the maze that afternoon not as a victim, but as a hunter. This is pure speculation. Is it? Poirot turned sharply, his eyes gleaming with familiar intensity. Then perhaps you can explain the hidden clue that everyone else overlooked, a detail so minute, so utterly insignificant to the casual observer, that only the guilty party would understand its significance. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small evidence envelope. When I examined the sundial's base where Lady Margaret's hand was found outstretched, I discovered more than her hidden journal. Caught in a tiny crevice of the weathered stone was this: a microscopic residue of medical adhesive, the specialized type used to secure surgical dressings. The room fell deadly silent. Dr. Pemberton's face had gone ashen, his eyes fixed on the envelope with unmistakable recognition. You see, Doctor, when Lady Margaret fell beside the sundial, reaching desperately for her hidden evidence, you were there. You struck her down with a surgical instrument, precise, professional, easily concealed in your medical bag. But in your haste to secure or destroy her journal, you inadvertently left behind this tiny trace of your profession, your presence, your guilt. Poirot's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You were most insistent that Inspector Morrison note the position of her hand, hoping perhaps that he would find the journal and dismiss it as the ravings of a madwoman. But you did not account for the little grey cells, which seek not the convenient truth, but the precise one. Dr. Pemberton stood frozen, his carefully constructed mask finally cracking to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. The psychological game had reached its crucial turning point, and I knew that the final gathering, where all would be revealed, was now inevitable. The truth, like Lady Margaret's final desperate reach toward the sundial, was finally within Poirot's grasp. The microscopic evidence hung in the air between them like an invisible accusation, and for a long moment Dr. Pemberton stood frozen, his carefully constructed mask of professional dignity wavering like a reflection in disturbed water. The silence stretched taut as a wire until Sir Reginald's voice broke it, raw with disbelief and dawning horror. Arthur, he whispered, the name carrying 30 years of friendship and trust. Tell me this man is wrong. Tell me you could never. Dr. Pemberton's hands trembled slightly as he straightened his waistcoat, a gesture so familiar and ordinary that it seemed grotesque in the present circumstances. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a strange mixture of defeat and intellectual pride. You speak of evidence, Monsieur Poirot, he said with forced calm, but what you describe is merely the natural residue of medical practice. I am a physician. Such materials are constantly about my person and clothing. Ah, but it is not merely the presence of the adhesive, Doctor, Poirot replied, his green eyes never leaving the physician's face. It is the specific type, surgical grade, designed for the most delicate procedures, and its location at the precise spot where Lady Margaret's hand lay outstretched. This speaks not of casual medical practice, but of intimate, violent contact. Mrs. Hartwell's quiet voice cut through the tension. "The medicines, Doctor. Lady Margaret mentioned that you had been most insistent about her taking certain nerve tonics, especially in the evenings. She said they made her feel disconnected from her own thoughts." Vivienne leaned forward, her sharp eyes fixed on the physician. "And the letters you received about her condition, letters she swore she never wrote. How convenient that they arrived just as she began questioning your treatment." Dr. Pemberton's composure cracked visibly, revealing glimpses of something cold and calculating beneath. "Margaret was a complex patient," he said, his voice taking on a clinical detachment that was more disturbing than any emotional outburst. "Her mind required careful management. She had begun to interfere with matters beyond her understanding, the charitable trusts, financial arrangements that had been stable for decades. So you decided to manage her mind as you might manage a difficult diagnosis?" Poirot's voice carried quiet condemnation. "By systematically undermining her confidence in her own perceptions. She was becoming erratic, making poor decisions that would have affected not only herself but others who depended on her stability." The doctor's words came faster now, as if some dam had burst within him. The switched medications, the adjusted correspondence, these were therapeutic interventions designed to help her recognize her own limitations. Sir Reginald stared at his longtime friend with mounting horror. "Good God, Arthur, you speak of Margaret as if she were some sort of experiment." "Every patient is an experiment in healing," Dr. Pemberton replied with chilling matter-of-factness. Margaret's case was simply more complex than most. Her resistance to guidance was remarkable, far beyond what I had anticipated. Most subjects would have recognized their need for professional oversight within weeks. The casual reference to Lady Margaret as a subject sent a visible shudder through the assembled group. Poirot moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But she proved too intelligent for your manipulations, did she not? Her journal documents every aspect of your psychological campaign with scientific precision. When you realized she was setting a trap, you knew your elaborate experiment had reached its natural conclusion." Dr. Pemberton's eyes flickered with something that might have been admiration. She was unexpectedly perceptive. Her analytical capabilities were far superior to what her social position suggested. When she summoned me to the maze that afternoon, claiming to have identified her tormentor, I knew she had compiled sufficient evidence to expose the entire methodology. "So you went prepared for violence," Poirot stated quietly. The doctor's silence was more damning than any confession. In that moment of hesitation, the full horror of his calculated brutality became clear to everyone present. Poirot straightened, his expression grave. "Inspector Morrison must be recalled immediately. Charles Ashworth sits wrongly accused while the true perpetrator of this elaborate crime stands before us. But this matter requires more than private revelation. It demands the full formal exposition that justice deserves." As Sir Reginald moved toward the telephone with shaking hands, I realized that we had witnessed not merely the unmasking of a murderer, but the exposure of a mind so twisted by intellectual arrogance that it had reduced human life to the status of a laboratory specimen. The final gathering would soon commence, and the complete truth of Lady Margaret's psychological torment and ultimate murder would finally be laid bare for all to witness. The little grey cells had pierced through the maze of deception, but the most chilling revelation was yet to come. Inspector Morrison arrived within the hour, his face bearing the grim expression of a man whose neat solution had come thoroughly unstuck. Behind him came Charles Ashworth, released from custody but looking haggard and bewildered by the rapid turn of events that had transformed him from condemned murderer to exonerated victim. "Monsieur Poirot," Morrison began without preamble, his voice tight with professional irritation, "your message spoke of new evidence. I confess I find this development most disturbing, given what appeared to be overwhelming proof of Mr. Ashworth's guilt." "Indeed, Inspector," Poirot replied with characteristic precision, positioning himself before the fireplace with that familiar authority that preceded his most significant revelations. But the truth, she has a way of asserting herself despite our attempts to contain her within convenient boundaries. The drawing-room had taken on the atmosphere of a courtroom as the assembled company arranged themselves in expectant silence. Dr. Pemberton sat rigidly upright, his medical bag clutched like a shield, while the others watched with a mixture of fascination and dread. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his green eyes sweeping over each face in turn. "We have before us not a simple crime of passion or greed, but something far more sinister, a calculated experiment in psychological control that culminated in cold-blooded murder." He turned first to Charles, whose relief was palpable despite his obvious exhaustion. "Monsieur Charles, your alibi was indeed fabricated, but not to conceal murder. You were attempting to discreetly sell a family heirloom, your grandfather's watch, to settle debts without your uncle's knowledge. When this failed, you returned through the servants' entrance, hoping to avoid detection. Shameful, perhaps, but hardly murderous." Charles nodded miserably. "I was desperate, Uncle. I didn't want you to know how badly I'd managed things." "The true culprit," Poirot continued, his gaze settling on Dr. Pemberton, "understood perfectly how to exploit such deception. They constructed a narrative of guilt around the obvious suspect while remaining hidden in plain sight." He produced the evidence envelope containing the microscopic adhesive residue. This fragment, found embedded in the sundial, where Lady Margaret lay dying, tells the complete story. It is specialized surgical adhesive, used exclusively for delicate medical procedures. Its presence speaks of intimate, violent contact, and of a weapon that was precise, professional, and easily concealed. Dr. Pemberton's composure began to crack visibly, his professional mask slipping to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. "For months," Poirot pressed on relentlessly, "you subjected Lady Margaret to systematic psychological torture, switching medications to cause confusion, intercepting correspondence, creating false medical records suggesting mental instability. You were constructing the perfect scenario, a woman driven to apparent madness who might be expected to meet a tragic end. She was interfering with matters beyond her comprehension," Dr. Pemberton burst out, his clinical detachment shattering completely. "The charitable trusts, the financial arrangements, she lacked the intellectual capacity for such complex responsibilities. By demonstrating her limitations through psychological manipulation?" Sir Reginald's voice was barely above a whisper, the betrayal cutting deeper than any physical wound. "Every patient presents opportunities for advancing medical understanding," Pemberton replied with chilling clinical tone. "Margaret's resistance to systematic pressure was remarkable, truly fascinating from a research perspective." Inspector Morrison stared in horror. "You speak of Lady Margaret as if she were some laboratory specimen." "When she proved too intelligent for your manipulations," Poirot continued, "when her journal documented every aspect of your campaign and she set her final trap, you knew the experiment had reached its natural conclusion. So you met her in the maze, armed with a surgical scalpel concealed in your medical bag." The room fell silent as the complete horror became clear. Pemberton had perverted healing into torture, medical knowledge into psychological warfare. "Arthur Pemberton," Morrison said formally, "I am arresting you for the murder of Lady Margaret Ashworth." As the handcuffs were applied, Pemberton offered no resistance. He glanced once toward the window where the maze stood silhouetted against the evening sky. "She should have accepted guidance," he murmured. "The pattern was so elegant." Later, as we prepared to depart, Poirot gazed thoughtfully at the darkening labyrinth. "The maze concealed nothing, Hastings," he said quietly. "It was the human heart that held the true secrets. Lady Margaret escaped neither the hedges nor the mind that hunted her, but she left sufficient thread for the little grey cells to follow. In the end, that is enough. The most perilous labyrinths, I reflected, are indeed those of the mind, where even the cleverest may lose their way unless they remain honest with themselves." The arrest of Dr. Pemberton sent shock waves through the household that would take months to fully settle. As Inspector Morrison led the disgraced physician away, his professional composure finally crumbled entirely, revealing the cold calculation that had lurked beneath his healing facade. Charles Ashworth, released from custody and cleared of all charges, embraced his uncle with tears of relief and genuine remorse for his deceptions about money. "The debts, uncle," Charles whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I was ashamed, but I swear I never—" "We shall manage it together," Sir Reginald replied, his own voice heavy with the weight of betrayal by his oldest friend. "What matters now is that Margaret has justice, and you are safe." In the days that followed, the household began the delicate process of healing. Mrs. Hartwell, freed from the psychological prison she had unknowingly shared with Lady Margaret, accepted Sir Reginald's offer to become his personal secretary, a position that restored both her dignity and financial security. The transformation was remarkable. No longer forced into invisibility, she blossomed into a woman of quiet authority. Vivienne Blackwood surprised everyone by requesting that the maze be preserved exactly as it was. Margaret loved it, she explained simply. It was her sanctuary until someone perverted it into a trap. The hedges themselves are innocent. They're part of her legacy. Charles, sobered by his ordeal and genuinely grateful for his uncle's forgiveness, accepted responsibility for managing a smaller estate property. The arrangement would allow him to rebuild his character while learning proper stewardship under Sir Reginald's watchful guidance. Dr. Pemberton's trial proceeded with swift efficiency. Lady Margaret's hidden journal, combined with Poirot's meticulous reconstruction of the psychological campaign and the physical evidence, painted an undeniable picture of calculated murder. The court was particularly horrified by the systematic nature of his psychological torture. The switched medications, intercepted correspondence, and deliberate erosion of his victim's confidence in her own perceptions. On our final evening at Ravenscroft Manor, Poirot gathered the household once more in the drawing-room. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows that seemed somehow gentler than before, as if the house itself was finally at peace. "You must understand," Poirot said quietly, his green eyes reflecting the firelight, "that Dr. Pemberton's crime was not born of passion or simple greed, but of intellectual arrogance. He saw Lady Margaret not as a patient deserving compassion, but as a fascinating specimen for his perverse experiments in psychological control." Sir Reginald's hands trembled slightly as he poured brandy. "I keep thinking I should have seen the signs. Arthur was my oldest friend. How does one become so clinical about human suffering?" "The corruption of healing into harm," Poirot replied thoughtfully, "is perhaps the most tragic perversion of human purpose. He possessed brilliant medical knowledge, but lost sight of the fundamental truth that his patients were human beings, not subjects for experimentation." "Margaret saw through him in the end," Sir Reginald said with quiet pride. "Her journals show such courage, such determination to expose the truth despite knowing the danger." "She died victorious," Poirot corrected gently. "Her careful documentation ensured that justice would ultimately prevail. Even in death, she guided us to the truth through the maze of deception he had constructed." The next morning brought our departure. As we prepared to leave, I found myself drawn once more to the maze, where someone had placed white roses beside the ancient sundial. The autumn mist clung to the hedges, creating an atmosphere both mysterious and peaceful. Poirot joined me there, his usually immaculate appearance slightly softened by the morning dampness. "She rests now, Hastings," he said quietly. The maze that was meant to be her tomb became instead her monument to truth. As we walked back through the twisting passages, I reflected on how the obvious solution had nearly condemned an innocent man, while allowing a calculating killer to remain free. The human mind, when it wishes to deceive, Poirot observed, creates patterns of misdirection that can fool even experienced investigators. But the little gray cells, they are not easily satisfied with convenient answers. They demand the truth, however complex or uncomfortable. Our train departed as the morning mist lifted, revealing the countryside in all its autumnal glory. Through the carriage window, I caught a final glimpse of the manor's ancient stones and the dark green maze that had concealed such deadly secrets. "Another case closed, Poirot," I said, settling into my seat. "Oui, but not forgotten," he replied, his fingertips meeting in their familiar steeple. Lady Margaret fought for her sanity against a mind that sought to steal it from her. Her intelligence and courage ensured that truth would triumph over deception. The most dangerous labyrinths, mon ami, are always those of the human heart, but even there, the little grey cells can find their way to justice. The affair at Ravenscroft Manor was closed, but its lessons about the labyrinthine nature of human deception would remain with us always.